In chapter 3, the building work on the wall in Jerusalem begins. Although the chapter is comprised of fairly repetitive material, describing features and people unknown to us, it is worth pausing to appreciate that this activity is occurring simultaneously. That is, at around 40 or so sections of the wall, groups of people are hard at work rebuilding or repairing these sections. There must have been some tensions in this community, which may have grown over the years. It was, after all, comprised of some people who had never left the place, that is, those who were never taken into exile, and those who were brought there, as well as the various batches of returnees. Nehemiah comes into this mix, and it may be that it is these tensions and his distrust of some of the leaders which is the reason why he was so initially secretive about the real purpose of his stay. So this great sustained energy all around the city is really a marvel. It must have felt great to see the sections rising in height and then meeting together, with the gates being remade and installed. It begs the question as to why it had not been done before. Perhaps there was too much division or fear of opposition, or simply not enough initiative and leadership. But now, here it is in the form of Nehemiah, and the progress is so swift that Sanballat is surprised at it. The description of the work is given in an anti-clockwise direction, from the sheep gate and back to it again. Some of the names of these gates, like the sheep gate and the fish gate, may have been because the sheep and fish were brought in through them. The sheep gate was near the temple, and perhaps they were brought in there for the sacrifices. The fish gate looked out onto the road to the coastal plain, and so again, perhaps the fish came in via that route. The gates, of course, were nothing like the ones we know of in our fields. They were something more like the entrance to a castle. They would be deep and have guard rooms in them. They were big enough to hold meetings in, hence the various references in the Bible to elders meeting in the gate or doing justice at the gates. The work on the wall then rebuilt sections which would meet at gates and which would then be installed and finished with the locking beams. The gates would attach into stone sockets in the ground, and the wooden beams would be attached on either side to the walls. When the gate was closed, another beam would fit across it and into these beams in the walls. They could then be locked by dropping small wooden dowels into a block placed on the beam. I can't imagine how satisfying it would feel to finish a section like that and have the gate locked securely. There were some groups of workers who even went on to do a second section. Such was their enthusiasm and commitment. It is also worth noting that some sections needed rebuilding, whilst others only needed repair. The eastern and northern sections of the wall were the most devastated, and so needed the most work. Another detail is that from verse 16 onwards, it is likely that the route or line of the wall was new. That is, until this point, Nehemiah was generally following the line of the old wall, but around certain sections, particularly the steep eastern side, which would have had loads of rubble pulled down the slopes, new sections were constructed. Chapter 4 switches back to what is called the Nehemiah Memoir, the document on which this book is based, which is thought by scholars to be the actual account written by Nehemiah himself. His enemies mock the Jewish efforts and describe them as feeble, but they are anything but. It seems as though Sanballat's mockery is merely for show. His rage reveals dismay at their progress. In verse 6, Nehemiah records that all the walls were now joined together, though at only half their height. This probably refers to those sections which had been breached and were now getting filled in. They are not yet fully secure. He adds the great explanation for their progress. For the people had a mind to work. What can be accomplished when God's people have a mind to work? With the rumours of attack swirling, we see more direct evidence of Nehemiah's leadership. Once again, as in verse 19, he prays, and then he organises defences at the weak spots. Verse 14 has, "As I looked these things over," which of course Nehemiah himself wrote. It is a small reference to his diligence and conscientiousness. He checks everything. Then he creates a new rota where some work and others guard, and even those who work are armed. Realizing that they are also vulnerable in being so spread out, he has a trumpeter next to him to rally in the event of attack. It is obvious as well that he is fully involved in everything, as the last verse records that he and his men never took off their clothes and their weapons never left their right hands. Nehemiah is a consummate leader who has responded to this crisis perfectly. No wonder he was so inspiring. In verse 14, he encourages the leaders with a classic speech, telling them not to fear and that God will fight for them, which he says again in verse 20. I doubt that Nehemiah was a great warrior like David, but he still stood on the wall with a sword in his hand. His commitment to Jerusalem and all who lived in it, plus his deep trust in God to protect them and bless the work, is a wonderful example of biblical leadership.